All right, well, welcome everybody. We got this nice deer in front of us here that the folks at Fish and Wildlife were kind enough to get this for our cutting demonstration for today. And there's a few things that we need to go over before we jump into this whole process of cutting up the deer. The big thing, and those of you that heard me in the past talk about this, is food safety. We don't normally think about that being a big deal in wildlife, but it is a big deal in wildlife, mainly because we have some folks that are not as experienced about making sure they're processing an animal in a sanitary way. For example, the guys down here in the meat lab, they did a really good job when this deer came in on Friday of taking the hide off and not getting a whole lot of hair on the hide. And the challenge we have with deer hair is it's hollow and it will stick to the carcass, and no matter how much water you spray on there from your garden hose, you're not going to get all that off. And so what a friend of mine, or mentor of mine I should say, when I was in grad school at the University of Illinois, Dr. McKeith, he was a big hunter. He said he just took a torch and he burned it off because it was hard to wash it off because of the way it would stick to the carcass. Why are we so worried about hair? Well, there's a lot of bacteria and pathogens that can be attached to the hair that once it gets on the carcass, it can actually transfer from the hair follicle to the carcass. And the reason being is this carcass not only supplies the perfect food for us, it's the perfect food for bacteria as well. So you can see they get on there quite easily. So these guys did a really good job of taking it off. You can see down here they left a little bit on here for purposes, for demonstration. That kind of stuff happens, and it's just fairly easy to come over here and just go ahead and trim that off. Or you can see that this is closer to the end. We can cut this off with with our hand saw as we get closer there. You also look at the inside of this animal. When this animal was gutted, so to speak, when they removed the internal organs, they were very, very careful of not cutting into the rumen or the stomach, or cutting into the intestines as well. Again, deer are in the same classification as cattle. They're ruminants, meaning they have a 4-chamber digestive system, or 4-chambered stomach, if you want to use that layman's term there. And that rumen, that's the biggest part of the digestive system, is the rumen, called the rumen. It's full of bacteria, and that bacteria's job is to get in there and to help digest that food that goes inside there. That's why these animals can eat grass and thrive on that as well. So you don't want to puncture that and get that into your product. You think, well, I'll wash it off. Yes, but just because it's wet doesn't necessarily mean it's clean. In the meats industry, if we get any type of contamination on the carcass, we have to trim that off. And so we want to make sure that we don't puncture those guts or the small intestines to get that stuff on the carcass as well. And then you notice back up in here where we have the colon and we get some fecal material in there. They've done a really good job of making sure that they removed the rectum and pulled the colon through. What some folks will do, and we do this when we harvest cattle here at the meat lab, is we'll tie off that rectum, or bung as we call it, so that none of that fecal material gets out. All right. So all this is done to make sure we're giving our family a safe product. All right. The other thing you notice on this one is what everybody has is the gunshot. All right. You can see where the firearm entered the body. This all needs to be cut out as well, because not only have you got that going in there, you've got, it feels like some broken bones where the bullet has gone through the bones, and so you'll have bone tissue in there as well. If you do get a gut shot, that goes back to, like we talked about just a second ago, of making sure that you don't have any digestive material in there. If you have a gut shot, now you got all kinds of digestive material in there. So you want to make sure you have a good sound shot as well. All right. And we'll remove this as we go through this. What I'm going to do is show you some things that we do with cattle, some things we do with sheep as well. There's really no right or wrong way of cutting these carcasses up. It's however you want it to be. I've had some hunters say they remove the loin, which is back closer to me. They keep the back legs, which they call the ham, so the back strap and the ham. And then I had one student that said they just threw this away, this shoulder up here. We taught him how to make summer sausage, and so now he bones that out and make summer sausage out of this area up here as well. But there's also some muscles in here that I'm going to use, that we utilize in the beef industry. I'm going to use it in here to kind of translate it to maybe get you some better cuts out of the shoulder as well. When you do this at home, there's a few things you need. A handsaw. All right, this is the main way we're going to cut through the bone. Not everybody has a bandsaw like you see behind me, and so this is a good way of making sure we have something to cut through the bone. There's a couple tricks with this. Number one is, it's probably hard to see in the camera there, but the teeth in the saw, all right? The teeth in the saw need to be pointed away from the handle, and mainly because I have more strength in my tricep pushing forward in that cutting motion than I do pulling it back. So we make sure the teeth is pointed away from the handle there so you get a better cut. The other thing is you paid for this whole blade, so use it. One of the things we joke about with our students is they come over here, and when they're using this, they'll go, little bitty cuts, all right? Again, it doesn't take much to use the entire blade. The other thing we see folks doing is not only using little cuts, but they'll try to force it. And you can see it, as I'm forcing it, it's binding up. And so let the saw do the work. Big long cuts like that. And you cut through the bone, all right? So you need a good handsaw. They're fairly easy to get. Some of your sporting goods stores have those as well. If not, everything can be bought online anymore, so you can find those handsaws online. You're also going to need a good knife. You'll see me use an array of about 3 different knives. This is the workhorse of a meat cutter's arsenal of knives. It's the boning knife. This is what a 6-inch boning knife is what we use a lot. Then you get into your steak knives that you can use as well. All right, again, do you need knives this big? Probably not. These are my knives that I use for processing cattle, and the cattle are big, so I need bigger knives. But you're going to need a good sharp knife. You also want to invest in one of these as well. This is a steel. And what this is designed to do is to hone the knife. It never will sharpen a knife, but it will hone the edge. And essentially, if you look at a edge of a knife, you'll see that it's not a smooth surface. There's actually little teeth in there. They're called feathers. And when I hit a bone, those feathers start to bend, and that steel just straightens those feathers back up. Eventually, those feathers are going to lose some of their power, and you're going to have to take that back to the stone and cut it up and sharpen it up so you can cut again. Always use a sharp knife. We've always heard the expression, you're more likely to cut yourself with a dull knife than you are a sharp knife, which is absolutely true, but it doesn't mean you can't practice knife safety with a sharp knife as well, because it will cut you as well. It's just going to go a lot deeper and cause a lot more damage. A few things that we talk about with knife safety with our students. Again, make sure that you don't stack something on a knife. So if I have my carcass on a knife and I go to grab something, I'm going to get cut that way. If a knife falls, don't try to catch it. Don't talk with your knife, all right? Know who's around you as well when you're cutting this up so we can keep everybody safe. 30 plus years of doing this, I've seen a lot of different things that can happen, all right? So always practice knife safety as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started on this carcass here. A little bit of history on this deer carcass. This was taken by Fish and Wildlife for the purposes of teaching what we're doing right now. This was a doe, and as you can see, this is a fairly sizable doe. It was a big doe. They estimated her to be somewhere around maybe 6 to 8 years old is what they told me when they dropped her off. The other thing you can notice on this one, it's got a little bit of fat cover on there. And not only does it have a little bit of fat cover on there, it's a white fat, all right? And if I press on it, it's pretty firm. It's not soft like a yellow fat. this is indication that this particular deer had found some grain, had something that had a high concentrate to it. So she was munching on some grain, which is going to give her this fat, hard white fat cover as well. If she solely was as searching and feeding on forage, she'd have a more yellow fat if she had very much fat on the outside as well. Why do I mention that? Solely because an animal is going to taste a lot like what it's been eating. So a forage fed animal is going to taste differently than one that's not only eating forage but eating grain as well. Where I'm from in Illinois, that was pretty common for the deer to be corn fed, as we jokingly said, because they would get in there and they would eat the corn during the summertime. And so they're going to taste different. You know, we see that a lot in animals. Grass finished beef tastes different than grain finished beef. Whichever one's better, that's up to you, so to speak. All right, so what I'm going to do is utilize some lamb cutting techniques, and I'm going to utilize some beef cutting techniques. So the first thing I'm going to do is come right in here and remove, this is what we call the ribs, we call the breast, and the front trotters, all right? So essentially where you see this kind of pocket right here, that's what I'm going to shoot for, all right? So I'm going to come over here, right where that bend in the arm is. Cut through the front leg and just continue on through the ribs. Okay. Now, I'm going to flip him over. The same on the other side. Hopefully you can see that a little bit better. You can see where that elbow bend is. Now, I'll tell you a little secret about these when we get closer to it. Through there, continue my cut through the ribs. All right, set this off to the side here. Again, some people will save these, others will not. It's totally up to you how you want to do this. You can even, and what we call boning out, removing the bone from the meat. You can do that as well if you want to. We're just going to go ahead and get rid of it. Same goes with these front trotters, all right? If we're going to use lamb as a model, those front trotters are pretty prize cut off the lamb. Again, you could do that like you would a lamb shanks, as the recipe is known as, or you can remove the meat off there and use that for a ground product as well. You also have the neck, so we're going to remove the neck as well. And so when I move the neck, I like to get down here where the neck meets the shoulder and just take it off there. Couple things about the neck, all right? You can see where this guy right here, you got a little bit of the still on there. And how do I know it's the trachea? It's got those ribs throughout there, all right? That's not a big deal. It'd be more ideal if you could remove that when you gut the animal, but that doesn't worry me too much because that just holds air, all right? That's where the air goes. So it's not that big of a deal that's there, all right? The other couple things about this neck we need to talk about is you can save this if you want to bone it out to make a ground product, a summer sausage or something along those lines. You could do that or you could throw it out. It's totally up to you. But the one thing I wanted you to notice is you see this joint right here, all right? This is called the atlas joint, and this is what allows that animal to move his head. And so when you're going to remove the head, we always shoot for that atlas joint, and we come in here and we just go boom, 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 all right? Kind of a W pattern there to remove the head. And so once you get the head freed from the bone, you just cut through the soft tissue and the head comes straight off there. You don't have to have an axe or a hatchet or a saw to do that. You can just do it with your knife, okay? So Part of the reason why I wanted to remove the front trotters, it allows me to see the ribs, and I can see the ends of the ribs. And like I said earlier, I'm going to utilize some techniques that we do in the lamb industry. And so when I'm processing a lamb, I'm going to remove the shoulder between the 4th and 5th ribs. So I reach in here, there's rib 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so mark that guy there like a good carpenter. Cut, measure twice, cut once. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, do the other side. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and so we should right there. And so over here, move to a bigger knife. Cut through the soft tissue till I get down to the bone. Allows me to get my saw inside here, cut through the backbone. There you go. Okay. Now, I'm going to move this back behind me on a table. Okay, as you can kind of tell, the video is probably a little bit choppy as we're editing things as we go through here. One of the things you probably noticed when I moved the other part of the carcass back to the table behind me, I knocked my knife on the ground. I could have just picked it up and continued like nothing happened, but what you didn't see off camera, I took it over and washed it because it was on the ground. Again, going back to some of that food safety stuff right there. All right, so here's our front shoulder. We got both halves of it, and you can come in here like this and split this guy in half. This is where if you got a friend to help you through this, to hold that makes life a little bit easier there. Okay, so we're through the bone there. There's a couple things I want to show you on this, okay? First off, that front leg, and a lot of people don't realize this, if an animal walks on 4 legs, deer, cattle, sheep, pigs, this whole front leg is not attached to the rest of the skeleton. So I can actually come in here and remove that front leg without really getting into any bone. Now you can see what we have here is remnants of where the gunshot had happened, all right? So you can see all the trauma right there. We need to come in here and really clean this up if we're going to utilize it, all right? And so this is, again, going back to that gunshot, not only removing the trauma from where the actual shot was, but kind of removing the blood clots and so on and so forth that happened from that trauma as well, all right? So we're going to set this off to the side. One of the things I wanted to show you is something we do in the beef industry, which is called the flat iron steak. Typically, cuts are tender versus tough by what that muscle did when it was alive. So muscles of locomotion tend to be tougher than muscles of support. And what it is it goes back to just like when we go into the gym and we lift weights, we hope our muscles get bigger. Well, if we go further down inside the muscle, we're actually trying to get the muscle fibers bigger. Now, see, these muscles of locomotion, they're designed to move the animal. So the muscle fibers get bigger. And once they get bigger, they need more connective tissue to hold them in place. And so like I showed you earlier, that this front leg is not attached to the rest of the skeleton. So that tells you those guys are working pretty hard to keep that front leg moving and keep it in place. So this is going to be one of those deals where we have something that's a little bit tougher than the loin or the backstrap, as you would call it, because they're muscles of locomotion. However, we notice in the beef industry we have some guys in there that tend to be a little bit more tender than the others because they're not getting used as much. And if you can kind of see here, what I'm dealing with underneath here, this is the shoulder blade that goes into the front leg. And you can see where I'm pushing down with my finger, there's a bone right there. It's called a medial ridge. So if I put my knife there, you can see how my knife is not going in. I move a little bit over and see how far it goes down. All right? So if you find that medial ridge and you come off to the side of it, I'll show you how to get this guy out of here. So I came along the side of the medial ridge, and see, even use my fingers, I kind of tore that muscle. It's a pretty tender muscle. You have what's called the flat iron stake right there. We can do this on the other side as well. There's our medial ridge. And it's always, this flat iron stake is going to be on the side that's closest to the inside of the elbow there. And sometimes you can come down to that bone and use your knife to scoot across. I'm trying to kind of point this towards the camera so you can see it. And come back to the front. And straight across. So you have that flat iron stake there, which is in the beef industry, that's what we use it for. It'd be a flat iron. All right, and you're asking, okay, why did you show us that? Well, the reason why I showed you that is this is one of those in the beef industry, they call this the diamond in the rough, okay? And what reason they say that is this cut on a beef carcass is actually the second most tender cut on a beef carcass. And some of my students that have utilized this and cut out the deer flat iron, if you will, say it's pretty tender as well. And you're thinking, well, you just told us everything and this shoulder's going to be tough. Absolutely, it's going to be, but this is one of those that kind of bucks the system. There's always an exception to every rule. So how did this guy stay so tender? Well, this muscle plus some of these others through here are part of the rotator cuff, all right? And we hear rotator cuff in baseball pitchers that tear the rotator cuff from throwing fastballs and curveballs and so on and so forth. And so deer, cattle, pigs, sheep, whatever you want to utilize, elk, moose, they don't throw fastballs, so that muscle doesn't get used. And so what they end up doing is they're walking like this. They may use the front legs to be directional, but they're not walking as much on those, so they're not developing that, okay? Now, what's interesting on the other side of this is another muscle. Across there. This is a good one that you're just going to want to grind, all right? It's a small kind of pencil-shaped muscle, or head of a pencil shape. You'll see that here in a second. See how it tapers down. All right. In the beef industry, that is referred to as the mock tender. All right. And the reason why it's called the mock tender is it does look like if you imagine this being coming off a beef animal, it does look like a filet mignon. All right. But it's not tender. All right. This is arguably one of the more tougher cuts on the carcass. And what always fascinates me is you got the second most tender cut over here and one of the more tougher cuts here, and they're separated by that medial ridge, that 1 little quarter of an inch right there. So you can pull that out and pull that flat iron out for a cut. Keep this guy for grind. You could take and bone the rest of this stuff out so that you have some meat to put in your grinder as well. And towards the end, we'll talk about that, all right? So essentially, you see, just take that off. And for time's sake, we'll just pretend like we already have taken all this off as well, okay? So I'm going to put these guys over to the side here. We're going to put all this back here. Remove the bones later. All right, let's get this guy back up here. Sometimes you get working here, your equipment gets in the way. All right, so we're going to set him up like this, and it's a good thing if you got a nice table to work from as well. Realizing not everybody's got the luxury of a meat slab like I do in front of them, but you can get yourself a good cutting block. I've seen a lot of people that use folding tables to do this on. That's not too bad to do that. Just make sure it's clean. Now that we've got bleach wipes and things like that, you can do that. The only challenge I see with the folding tables, they don't set up as high as these cutting blocks do, so you're bent over a little bit more. So it's going to put a little bit more pressure on your back there. But be that as it may, once you get your carcass back like this, you can see we've taken the shoulder off. Now I want to take these two hind legs off here. All right, and so you can see how this muscle comes down and meets about right where that saw is, okay? These are your sirloins, this is your loin, and this is your rack. And so right about where the curvature comes down and starts to flatten out is where I'm gonna cut this guy. Sometimes you get a little bound up there. See, it's always good you see the instructors having a little bit of issue, so you know it's not always as smooth as it appears to be sometimes. There we go. So I just cut through the bone. I'm going to use my knife to cut through the remaining soft tissue there as well. So we're going to put this back over here and come back to him in a second. So we got our two legs here, and again, we can separate these two, all right? Just like we did with the shoulder, I'm going to use my handsaw to cut through this. Yeah, she was a little bit older. You heard me say she was a little bit older. I do know she was older because the game wardens that brought her in on Friday told me that, and they used the dentition scores to do that. I can tell it's a little bit older looking at some of the skeletal indicators as well. And one of the things that you can always tell, get this side cleaned up here. All right, I don't know if you zoom in on that, Kevin, where my finger is there. This is the sacral region of the vertebrae there. So we got the coming back to make the tail is what you're seeing here. This looks like one solid bone, and it is one solid bone, but it started out as individual vertebrae. As the animal gets older, those bones fuse together. And so they thought that she was about a 6 to 8 year old animal when she came in, and you can tell she's got a little bit of age on her as well because all this is fused right here. So why do we bring that up? Well, younger animals tend to be more tender than older animals. So not only do we have the muscle of locomotion versus muscle support phenomenon happening there, we also have this whole concept of age of the animal. And so what ends up happening with these guys is that connective tissue we talked about earlier. As we get older, all right, the connective tissue crosslinks. And so if I took a piece of string, if you imagine this steel as being a muscle fiber, and I took a piece of string and looped around there, that would be the connective tissue on a younger animal. As they get older, those let me try that again. Those connective tissues starts to cross-link, and so instead of looking like a piece of string going around there, it's going to look like a chain-link fence going around there with older animals. All right. Somewhat of the same phenomenon happens in humans as well. As we get older, we're not as flexible. All right, and that's one of the things that plays in there as well, is that flexibility thing. So younger animals, younger people tend to be more flexible, so it goes back to that as well. So we know that not only are we dealing with now these hind legs, which are muscles of locomotion, we also know that we're dealing with an older animal as well. So we're really going to have some tenderness issues in this hind leg. So does that mean we just cut it up and grind it into deer burger or summer sausage? You can. If you wanted to salvage some of this and make roast, you could do that as well. In order to make this more tender, you're going to have to use what we call the slow and low method. Very low temperature, long period of time. Plus, you're going to need a little bit of moisture in there, kind of like a crock pot, if you will, which is going to keep it slow and low, as well as that moisture is going to get in there and break down that connective tissue as well. So there's a number of things you can do with this. I've actually had a chef friend who was the executive chef here on campus. He was a big hunter, and one of his sous chefs was a hunter as well. They tried to do like a deer prosciutto or deer country ham with these guys, so you could utilize the same techniques you would to make a country ham on these legs. I never did hear how it turned out. I just know that they tried that, and I have heard of a few other people trying that as well. So you could do that, or you could cut it up into roast. And what I'll do is I'll show you a couple ways. We got two of them here. You could do a roast where you can see where this pelvic bone is. I could come in here with my boning knife, come back along here. Okay, now one of the things you're going to want to look for, you can see right there. Can you see that, Kevin? There's like a ball inside there. All right, that's the head of the femur. All right, so I want to try to cut through that. And so what I'll end up doing is coming back over to the edge of the block so I can have a little bit of pressure down here. Kind of work my knife inside there, okay? Okay. This is where it gets to be a little challenging. Then I come back here. It's kind of hard to see what I'm doing there, but I'll show you here in a second. All right. So, as you can see, we removed that, all right? And so what I ended up doing is getting my knife in here and kind of scooping around there. There's a little tendon right there you need to cut, and that helps free that guy up as well. Then you notice I came back over here towards the back part of this pelvic bone and come back across to free that up even more. And so once you do that, now it should be fairly easy to come in here and remove the rest of this bone. Just like so. Now, as you can see, we got this straight little flap here. If I come in here like this and cut that guy off, all right, if you're kind of familiar with your beef cuts, that looks like a sirloin, doesn't it? And it essentially is a sirloin. So what we're going to do is trim him up a little bit here. Okay, got your sirloin. I'm a big fan of cutting everything about 1 inch thick so we don't overcook anything. So now you've created your own deer sirloin steaks off that leg. Like so. And the other thing you could do is come in here, you can see right here, there's still a little bit of that tenderloin, or filet mignon, if you will, in here. You can take that guy out as well. A little bit of dried up tissue there, we're going to remove that. So you got that little bit of tenderloin there. And you could come in here with this guy and continue to remove the lean from the bone there for your ground product. It gets a little tricky back over here, but you can do that as well. What I've heard of some people doing is taking some of these pieces, that's got a little bit more of that contamination in there. And just like we do in the beef industry, come around here, as you can see what I'm doing here, taking this big chunk of lean right here, removing some of your fat. And cutting it up into lamb stew. All right, I do know you're going to learn about canning deer meat, okay? And so you can use these little chunks like that for canning purposes if you want to. But you can kind of do that on these big lean pieces, get some pieces that you can use for canning as well. Once you do that, it makes it a little bit easier to kind of work with this guy. And so you can see the head of that femur right there. This part right here, his Latin name is the quadriceps muscle. And the reason why it's called the quadriceps is 4 muscle heads inside there. In the beef industry, we call this the knuckle or the tip. And so what you can do is come in here, right next to that, ball that femur, and you can see I'm pushing in with the tip of my knife. I'm following that femur bone all the way around. Okay? It gets a little tricky back here towards the knee, and I'll show you why here in a second. And my knife has developed a bit of a drag, so bring it over here. Somebody asked me one time, how often do you steel your knife? I usually steel my knife whenever I feel a drag in there like I did there. Some guys will come in and every time they hit a bone, they'll steel their knife. So it's up to you. You'll get to the point where if you use these a lot more, you'll be able to feel when that knife is starting to fade away from you. All right, getting back to our knuckle here, you can see we had a bone there. That's what made, when we got back to this portion of the back leg, it made it a little bit more tricky because we had that bone right there. That's the kneecap or the patella, all right? So we can remove that guy there, all right? If you want to, you can clean this up as well. The outer part of this, get rid of some of this heavy connective tissue that you see right through here, okay? You can even come in here and take the back part of that off. And you have, let's get this looking a little bit nicer up front. Sorry, I'm an old retail meat cutter, so everything has to look really nice, all right? And so now you have a knuckle roast or a tip roast if you want to use that. And you've got our pieces over here for grinding as well. Okay, so you got a nice roast right there. If you want more roast, you can come in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come right on the top of this femur bone, and I'm going to remove, this is called the inside, all right, the inside portion of it. And you'll see me kind of coming in here looking for and pulling at the same time. I'm looking for a seam that sits inside here. As soon as I find it, I'll show you here. And that's going to help me remove this guy, all right? So you can see, get this out of the way. So you can see in there, there's that seam, all right? And that's going to help me to remove that. Sometimes, folks, cutting meat is not necessarily a huge thing. You just got to know which seam to find and which seam to follow, okay? And again, we got another nice roast here. Clean a little bit of this dehydrated surface on there. Now, we're filming this on Monday. This deer came to us Friday, and so the guys in the lab skinned it on Friday, and then it hang in the cooler over the weekend. You can see even just that 2 days of hanging how dehydrated the surface got, all right? Ideally, you could leave the hide on while it cools down. The only issue with that is leaving the hide on while it cools down. Once you got a cool carcass, it makes it even more difficult removing that hide. And it even makes it more difficult removing that hide and keeping things clean and sanitary. So you see how you got a little bit of give and take there. All right. Again, got another roast. I'm going to come in here, remove this bottom part. Okay. Probably come in here, move a little bit of this. Okay. Clean it up a little bit. Got another nice roast there. And then this muscle back here, and the reason why I didn't take this off and leave it with that, as you can see, there's a lot of connective tissue inside there, all right? I don't know if you could focus in on that or not, Kevin. Does that help if I move it closer to the camera? Maybe kind of hard to see, but you can see there's little bands of connective tissue in there. Not only was this a big muscle of locomotion, but it's got a lot of connective tissue in there as well. So this might be better off to use as something you're going to put in the grinder as well. So you can come in here and continue to remove this guy, and we're going to use this for grinding purposes. Okay. Yeah. Sometimes, you know, I tell my students a lot of times it's really easy if you do this and you kind of treat it like you're whittling wood, and it's easy to remove it when you do that kind of stuff, when you pretend you're whittling. So you can get in there and get a lot of that off of there. So you can see it's kind of interesting on these guys. You can see, let's get this femur bone. We'll go ahead and remove this femur bone. There's just something kind of neat to talk about in here. I'm not a physiologist by any stretch of the means, but there's still some things that we learn, and it's kind of neat to pass them on when we figure them out. This is the other thing that happens is when they get older, these bones get a little bit more fused together. Makes it hard to get them off of there. So there's that seam right there. And I'm only doing this for something kind of neat to show you there that we don't always think about. Got our bone. We'll just move this guy over here. All right, move these guys out of the way so you can see what we're talking about. See how curved that femur is? You can put your hand underneath it like that. The femurs off of pigs and the femurs off of cattle are straight. They're not curved like that. And a lot of that curvature is part of the reason why deer can jump so high there. That's almost like a spring, if you will. And so you see that curvature in there. Whenever you see that kind of curved femur there, it's usually an indication of an animal that can jump pretty high. And so you can see that as well. So set him off to the side there. Told you there's some other things you can do. So you can do what we did on the other leg and come in here and remove this bone as well and get your boneless sirloins if you want to. But you can also come in here, and I'm going to switch to a bigger knife here. And if you wanted to make some steaks, some leg steaks, so I guess you call it more of a leg slice. So if you wanted that nice round bone inside there, this is how you would do it. So if you wanted the bone in there for a leg slice, you could do something like that. If you wanted it boneless, you could go in there and cut it like that as well with by how we did the roast, and go ahead and cut your slices there. Another thing I've seen folks do as well, especially if you have a big gathering of folks coming over to celebrate having a deer, what I've seen some people do is, imagine this being the whole piece again, is they'll take some fat, and there's There's a fat netting that you can get. You have to talk really sweet to your meat processor to get that. It's the fat netting that surrounds the stomach of the animal, and so you could lace that around there and then slow roast this leg. And in the beef industry, we would call this a steamship round. And you can do that with this guy as well and produce kind of a steamship, if you will, roast off this ham, as I heard some deer hunters call this. And then now you've got something where on a nice Sunday dinner, if you're wanting to celebrate getting a deer, that you can slice off those pieces there like you would a steamship round. You say, well, why do you need that fat netting? You don't necessarily need it, but part of the reason why you want that is it gives a little bit more protection when it's cooking, and some of that fat will cook into the meat as well, okay? So there's a number of things you can do with that, and you can see, as I've said before, I'm using some lamb processing techniques mixed in with some beef processing techniques to make sure that we have a different way of cutting things up. So now we're left with the part that everybody enjoys, and that's the loin or the back strap, all right? And you can see right here on the inside, there's these two tenderloins, all right? In the, get this off the side here. In the beef industry, we call this the Filet Mignon. Obviously, it'd be about 10 times the size of this one. Pork industry, they call that a Tenderloin Catfish. It kind of does resemble a fish when you take it off there. And so you can do the same. You can reach in here. And these guys, you got to be very, very careful, because this is a very tender muscle. It's actually the most tender cut on the entire carcass. And so it can tear pretty easy. And you can see I'm kind of using my knife to follow the curvature of those bones and then kind of strip it out. What a lot of guys will do, and I've been known to do this as well, as soon as they get that opened up, they can just lift it out of there, okay? Now, you might be tempted, some of you, I've heard some deer hunters like the flavor of deer fat, others don't. If you're a big deer fat person, you might be tempted to leave that on there, but usually there's lymph nodes inside there. And I'm a very big proponent of, if you find a lymph node, throw it away. And the reason why I say that with the lymph nodes is one simple fact: they can harbor a lot of bacteria. So I want to remove that fear of having any bacteria in there, okay? So you got your tenderloins there, and like I said, again, you might want to clean them up, make sure there's no lymph nodes in there, things like that. Lymph nodes are really common on carcasses. I'm not much of a hunter, all right? I used to be when I was a kid. I don't as an adult, but I always know when it's getting close to hunting season. Two reasons. Number one, it's hard to find anybody around here because most of the guys and the kids that work down here are hunters. The other thing is I start getting phone calls from people saying, there's these tan things, nodules that look like pencil erasers on my deer carcass. Those are natural. Those are lymph nodes, so it's no big deal there, all right? All right, so there's a couple ways you can do this to remove this loin, and I'm going to do it this way. You see how it's kind of setting natural. You got your vertebrae right here, and so you can come on either side of that, come all the way down. Be a little careful when you start cutting towards yourself, and just gently start to take this guy out. Deer hunters refer to this as the back strap. You'll hear me use those back strap and loin as interchangeable. Okay. And again, this is where it gets to be a little bit of a challenge, because your instinct is to start to pull on this guy, but you don't want to do that because it can be pretty easy to tear these muscles. And the other thing I tell my students when we're teaching them how to do this is, no matter how sharp your knife is, it will never ever cut through bone. So if you get up to a bone and you think you can saw through it, most of the time you're not going to be able to. Just kind of move it back a little bit, and that'll give you another avenue to get around that bone, because you're not going to cut through that bone. You can tell this is a pretty big deer. It's got a big loin inside of her there. You can see how I just kind of remove that, just like so. Okay. There's one loin. Come in and remove the other side. Again, like I said earlier, there's really no right or wrong way of doing this since we can't sell this. All right? You hear me say things that make it look nice, make it look nice. That just goes back to my days of being a retail meat cutter where everything had to look nice. But for you, you know, you're just trying to get something out of this to feed your family, provide for the environment, and so on and so forth. So again, you know, there's no really right or wrong way of doing this. I'm just trying to show you some techniques we use in the meats industry that are both for beef and lamb, okay? Maybe a few pork ones in here as well. But I'm just going to try to get this loin freed. Again, you can see it comes right off. Okay, set this off to the side again. Okay. So now we have our two back straps, our two loins, all right? And so here's a bit of an issue we have. See that silver skin on there? That's connective tissue. And some folks will leave it on there, and you can if you want. Others will take it off. And so we call this peeling the loin or peeling the tender. You'll see here some chefs use that. And you can see I just took my knife, got underneath there, angle my knife blade up a little bit, and take that connective tissue off of there. Again, we want to take just the connective tissue off there. It's going to make this a little bit more tender. This is a muscle of support, so these guys are going to be a little bit more tender than your muscles of locomotion. So get that off the side there. A couple things you can do with this. Let's get this removed. You could come in here and cut some medallions like so. Okay. Or if that's too small for you, you can butterfly. All right. So I usually tell folks, you know, it's kind of hard to tell with that big knife, but if you want to make sure everything stays straight, so essentially you want each side to be equal, all right? That can be a challenge sometimes when you're cutting with a smaller knife like this, and where you have a tendency where your knuckles hit the tabletop to veer that blade one way or the other, and so you get one side that may be an inch, another side that may be an inch and a quarter. One of the ways to remedy that is you move that all the way to the back of the block using a small knife, and your knife can go all the way down and your knuckles won't hit the block top. You know, just a little thing that you can do. I'm going to show you something using a smaller knife that you can do. So instead of making the medallions, come in here and you go almost all the way through. Stop. Other side equal. And make butterflies. Cut. They're almost all the way through. Cut again. Make butterflies. This is a pork technique. So I told you I'd bring in a little bit of pork as well. Gives you a little bit bigger serving size. Okay. Just like so. All right. Do that with your cuts. All right. Do that, repeat it with the other side as well. So you can see how we've gone through this. We've used some lamb cutting techniques. So how I broke the carcass down, that was a lamb cutting technique. Between the fourth and fifth rib, at that juncture at the back, removing the hind legs from the loin saddle. Those are lamb cutting techniques. The butterfly chops, those are a pork technique there. The The flat iron steak there, that's a beef, and then some of these others kind of go hand in hand with beef and pork, the sirloins and the loins as well. Flavor-wise with these guys, like we talked about earlier in the presentation, is they're gonna taste a lot like what they've been eating. Okay, a forage-based animal is going to taste different than one that's been eating some grain as well. The wonderful thing about this is it can be a good carrier of flavor. So if you wanted to marinate these guys, you could. Marinate's going to do two things, all right? Marinate is going to add some flavor. So like when you go to the grocery store and you see where it says marinate for half an hour, that's a flavor enhancing marinate. All right, you may be able to find a marinade that says marinate 24 hours. That's a tenderizing marinade. And with this particular animal that was a little bit older, you may want to kind of play around with the length of time to tenderize those guys if you want to use a liquid tenderizer to kind of soften that tissue up a little bit as well. So there's some fun you can have with that. You can experiment with different recipes. You can find those online as well and have something a little bit just more different than throwing it on the grill. You can add some flavor enhancement to it as well. You notice, as I said earlier, we would talk about the grinding portion of it. We've been kind of setting some of these pieces off, and we got some pieces back there that we need to bone out to make into grind. And so nowadays, if you're a do-it-yourselfer, you can go to any store or even online now and buy a little kitchen grinder, all right? And you grind this down. Now you can see these guys are pretty lean, and what a lot of meat processors will do will add some pork fat back into it. So if I'm using a pound of pork fat, I'm going to use a pound of deer. Okay, you can play with that as a 1-to-1 ratio, or maybe back more of the pork fat off if you want, to get more of the deer flavor in there as well. What a lot of folks will use is the Boston butt or the shoulders, all right? They tend to be a little bit fattier than the rest of the pig carcass. So they use that as a fat block, if you will, for the lean block, which is your deer. Make ground deer. You can also, what I hear a lot of folks wanting is summer sausage, okay? There's a few things we need to talk about with summer sausage. You can go to a sporting goods store, and I'm thinking of along the lines of the Bass Pro Shops and the Cabela's and Sportsman's Warehouses and things like that, where they have the summer sausage kits, okay? My suggestion is you follow those recipes to a T, because a lot of times they have things in there that if we don't use or we misuse, we can hurt ourselves. And the one that comes to mind is nitrite. There's a reason why we add nitrite to these products, these summer sausage cured meat products, is number one, it prevents the growth of a pathogen called Clostridium botulinum, which causes the disease botulism, all right? That's the main reason why we add these. And the reason why is we're smoking and cooking these guys at such a low temperature that if one of those pathogens were present, he can now replicate pretty quick because we're in his wheelhouse of growth. So we add that to prevent that. We also add that it not only does it prevent the growth of Clostridium botulinum, but it gives it that cured meat taste and that cured meat color. All right? A little bit of it is good. A lot of it can be very harmful to human health. So make sure that when you're doing these summer sausage kits, if that kind of product is in there, that you're doing things to a T. If it says this recipe is for 25 pounds, don't just look at it and think, I think that's 25 pounds. Actually get a scale and weigh it out, all right? Because again, some of these products that are seasonings, especially that nitrite, can be harmful to human health if we use too much of it, all right? And if we don't use it, we could get ourselves in trouble as well. So if you're buying those kits, make sure you follow those to the T. The other thing is folks will want to put cheese in there. Meat's always better with cheese. Go online and find a high temperature cheese. That's a cheese that won't melt during the cooking process. It will maintain its shape. Reason why you want that, your store-bought traditional cheeses, once they melt and they re-solidify, they tend to get a sour taste to them, so you want to prevent that. Plus, you want to be able to see the cheese in there. And so those high-temperature cheeses work well. You get a high-temperature cheddar cheese, high-temperature Swiss, pepper jack, all that kind of stuff. It's a high-temperature cheese is what you're going to want to use. Others will want to do a jalapeno added to it. All right, when you do that, do not use fresh jalapenos and do not use pickled jalapenos. Make sure you're using dried jalapenos. The reason being is the fresh and the pickled have a high acid content, and it's going to denature those proteins, that they won't stick together. You add salt in there, it extracts those proteins that help those guys bind together. You add an acid and they won't bind together very well. So we use dried jalapenos for that as well. So again, you can have fun with it. There's several recipes for summer sausage. Just make sure you follow those recipes to a T. And with that, we'll entertain any questions.